Friends, viewers, history, and armor enthusiasts, before we dive into the forgotten archives, into the dramatic story of an engineering feat, do me a favor, subscribe to this channel and like this video. Why? Because today we're breaking down more than just the dry history of a tank. We'll touch on themes of the spirit of resistance, engineering genius under total prohibition, and how the shadow of war gives birth to ghosts of metal. This is the story of the ARL-44, a Phoenix tank, a tank symbol. And I want your comments, your thoughts, to become part of this investigation. Write what you think about the role of weapons as a symbol of national pride. Stay tuned. This will be a long but gripping story. There's a persistent, almost cliched notion that France, after that terrible blitzkrieg defeat in May-June 1940, resigned itself, that the country lay down under German occupation, and that was it. Engineers, workers, all obediently worked for the Wehrmacht. Period. The picture is like this: Parisian cafes, German officers, and somewhere in the distance, factories smoke, forging iron for panthers and tigers. And the resistance is somewhere out there, underground, with pistols and explosives, but certainly not in drawing offices or at machine tools. Well, that's a half-truth, and a half-truth, as we know, is worse than a lie. Yes, the monstrous blow of the blitzkrieg paralyzed the country. Yes, the key industrial giants associated with tank building ended up in the occupied territory. And yes, some of them did indeed fulfill German orders. It was a heavy, morally terrible choice between collaboration and complete destruction, between the lives of workers and patriotism. History doesn't like black and white pictures. But there was another reality. Quiet, hidden, dangerous one. The very one where the French mind, the French engineering school, did not surrender. It went into the shadows. And while some pulled the yoke under German control, others, in basements, in country villas, in supposedly abandoned workshops, were drawing, calculating, designing, dreaming. They couldn't forge steel for new machines, but they could forge ideas. And these ideas, these developments made literally under the nose of the Gestapo, became the very seed from which, immediately after the liberation, new post-war French tank building sprouted. It was not born out of thin air. It was born out of stubbornness, from the memory of the best France had in 1940. And the best, the standard, the pinnacle of pre-war thought was, without a doubt, the heavy tank Char B bis. A real steel monster, a land battleship with two guns, a 75mm in the hull and a 47mm in the turret, an armor monstrous for its time. The Germans feared and respected it. And it was around its heirs, around the enterprises that gave birth to this tank, that the very shadow resistance of engineers concentrated. Here we need to make a historical and economic footnote. We are talking about the period of the French state, État français, the Vichy regime. Its economy was a complex mechanism of coercion, cooperation, and survival. German orders provided work and bread for thousands, but at the cost of feeding the enemy war machine. However, in this oppressive system, niches appeared. For example, the Study Bureau, Bureau d'études, could formally work on civilian projects or improving old French equipment, while secretly laying down concepts for the future. This is intellectual sabotage. It was not tanks that were born, but their souls imprisoned in blueprints. So, who were these people? Two main centers. First, the Forges et Chantiers de la Méditerranée, FCM, plant in the suburbs of Toulon. Geographically lucky, it ended up in the so-called Free Zone, under the control of the puppet Vichy government, but still not under the direct German boot. Here one could still move one's fingers. And they moved. For example, they worked on modernization projects for the Saumur S-35 cavalry tank. FCM engineers developed designs for 2- and 3-man turrets equipped with a more powerful 47mm gun. It was a step towards a more balanced and powerful machine. They kept the engineering thought alive. Second, Ateliers de Construction de Roule, ARL, in Roule-Malmaison, just west of Paris. Now this is a real hot spot. The Germans were right there within 2 steps, but ARL had a special steely core. Until 1936, it was the tank division of the French arms giant APX, Ateliers de Puteaux. These guys created turrets and systems for the best French tanks. They knew a thing or two about armor and fire, and they had no intention of losing that knowledge. And here's the scene. Both of these firms had been working since 1937 on improving the Char B. Prototypes of the B-1 were born, the first sketches for the future B-40, a next-level machine, began. They even worked together in fierce competition on projects for super-heavy monsters to strengthen the Maginot Line. They designed giants weighing around 70 tons. The war interrupted this, but the experience and engineering teams remained. And then came the darkest hour. In the fall of 1942, Operation Anton began. The Germans occupied the former Free Zone. Toulon fell. The FCM plant was now also under full control. It seemed like the end. All bridges burned. But no, the work didn't stop. It became even more secretive, more scattered. Here's a fascinating detail: the SARL-42 project. Back in 1942, ARL's Design Bureau, led by chief designer Maurice Lavrot, began developing a deep modernization of the Somua S-35. They called it SARL-42, Somua ARL-42. They completely redesigned the hull. The front received more rational slopes, the radio operator's position was removed, and the hull became simpler. But the main thing was a new, large turret ring with a diameter of over 1,500 millimeters. This was a revolutionary step for French tanks, which traditionally suffered from cramped turrets. They planned to install a new three-man turret with a long-barreled 75mm gun, Model 44. And here's the most ingenious partisan move. The work was split. The hull was developed in Rueil-Malmaison, in the occupied zone, and the turret and the new gun were designed by a group of engineers led by Mr. Deven and Mr. Lafargue in Cassade, which was in the still unoccupied zone at that time. They used the ballistics of the Schneider 75mm anti-aircraft gun as a basis. Imagine secret coordination between 2 points on the map, separated by the front line. Sketches, calculations, technical data transmitted through trusted people. This is the true resistance of the mind. Of course, after November 1942, when the Germans took over all of France, the work on SARL-42 had to be mothballed, as well as work on the 30-ton Char B successor. But the seed was sown. The engineers gained invaluable experience in designing a modern tank hull with sloped armor and a large turret ring. This experience was not in vain. And now the turning point. August 1944. Paris is liberated. By autumn, a significant part of France is cleared of occupiers. And what happens? The very next day, it feels like French industry, still smoking from the war, raises its head. And it doesn't start from scratch. It pulls out those very hidden, cherished folders labeled Top Secret. Projects SARL-42, developments on the B-40, sketches of new guns. All of this instantly becomes relevant. But the world has changed. The French army, reforming, looked around and received a shock. Their expected arsenal of pre-war Chars B and Somas was morally obsolete. And around, on the battlefields of Normandy and during the liberation, lay evidence of a new level of tank warfare: German Panthers, Tigers, and even the monstrous King Tigers, PZ-KPFW Tiger OSP.B. They were studied, measured, and disassembled. These trophies became a chilling standard and a challenge. The future French tank had to fight these monsters. And here begins the political and economic drama. France in 1944-45 is a country in ruins, but with enormous ambitions. It desperately needs to restore its status as a great power. And a great power must have its own tanks. Not English, not American, but its own. This is a matter of national prestige, politics, and the future of the military-industrial complex. October 9, 1944. A historic document. Lieutenant General Layer, Chief of Staff of the French Army, signs an order to begin work on new armored vehicles. And point number 2 in it is a tank with a combat weight of 35 tons, a 75mm gun, a 500 horsepower Talbot engine, and armor like the American Sherman. And here's the madness. The tank must go into series production straight from the drawing board, without a prototype. And they want 500 units. the first by May 1945, with a production rate of 50 to 70 per month. For a destroyed industry, these are fantasy numbers. But it's a political order. The country needs a symbol of rebirth. And they decide to make it based on the Char B concept. Yes, the same pre-war dinosaur, but modernized, one gun, sloped armor. However, reality quickly intervened. By the end of 1944, looking at the captured Panthers, it became clear that the 75mm gun was weak. Appetites grew. They remembered the 90mm anti-aircraft gun. And on December 28, 1944, they decided that 300 of the 500 tanks would have a 90mm gun. The deadlines began to slip. The tank finally got a name in January 1945, ARL-44. Production was divided between Renault and FAMH, Saint-Chamond, but the requirements continued to change. The engineers, led by the newly formed consortium DEFA, the future GIAT and Nexter, worked in a feverish rhythm. Instead of a 75mm gun, they now wanted a super-powerful 90mm SA-45 with a barrel length of 65 calibers, created with an eye on the German 88mm KWK-43. Its shell flew at a speed of 1,000 meters per second and could pierce almost any enemy armor. But such a gun needed a new, larger turret. And to protect against similar guns, they demanded to double the frontal armor, from 60 to 120 millimeters. The weight soared from 35 to 48 tons. The French engine no longer sufficed. We had to turn to trophy German Maybachs from the same Panthers and Tigers. The irony of history, a French tank, conceived as a symbol of liberation, received the heart of its former enemy. Meanwhile, the war in Europe ended in May 1945. The urgency disappeared. The military, disillusioned with the delays, slashed the order from 500 to 150 vehicles. And in parallel, they announced a competition for a new, more advanced tank, the future AMX M4. The ARL-44 was becoming obsolete before it was even born. It was a transitional model, a school desk for industry. And finally, after all the torments, the first prototype was ready on March 1, 1946. The first production tank left the factory only in June 1947, 2 years later than the insane plans of 1944. In total, not 150, but only 60 vehicles were built, 24 by Renault and 36 by FAMH. What was the ARL-44 like? A colossal, archaic-looking machine. A huge hull with tracks like the pre-war Char B, a modern sloped front plate 120 millimeters thick, a German Maybach engine, and a massive new turret with a long, fearsome 90 millimeters cannon. It was a hybrid of the past and the future, a tank contradiction. It was powerful in armor and armament, but slow, unreliable, with an outdated suspension that caused constant breakdowns. It entered service only in 1951, when the era of heavy tanks was already passing. The 503rd Tank Regiment solemnly paraded it on Bastille Day, July 14, 1951. But its service was short and sad. It was quickly reclassified as a tank destroyer. In 1952, after a series of breakdowns, it was removed from service. More reliable American Pershings, M26, and the promising French AMX-50 were on the way. The ARL-44 became a museum piece almost immediately. So why is this story so important? The ARL-44 was not a successful tank. It was not a masterpiece, but it was a titanic effort of will. It was the first step. It allowed French engineers to regain their skills, test new technologies, sloped armor, powerful guns, large turrets, and re-establish industrial cooperation. Without the ARL-44, there would have been no brilliant AMX-13, no legendary AMX-30, no modern Leclerc. It was a necessary, painful, and proud stage. It is a monument to those engineers who drew in the darkness of the occupation, to the stubbornness of a nation that wanted to forge its own sword again. It is a tank that was born too late, but without which the future would not have happened. So, friends, what do you think? Was the ARL-44 a heroic failure or a necessary stepping stone? Could France have taken a different path? Write your opinions in the comments. Let's discuss. If you were captivated by this story of metal, will, and the shadow of war, put a like. It really helps the channel. And subscribe so you don't miss our next investigations into forgotten pages of history. After all, history is not just about victories. Often, it's about the dignity found in struggle, even if it's a struggle with iron and time. Thanks for watching to the end.